When Adriana Lima first stepped into the fluorescent hallway of a New York model apartment, she did not look like an angel. She looked like what she was, a shy teenager from Salvador, carrying a suitcase, a Portuguese accent, and the kind of beauty that made adults talk over her head as if she were already a product. Casting directors told her where to stand, when to turn, how to smile. Her job was to be chosen. Her only power, at first, was to say yes. 20 years later, the same woman walked down the Victoria's Secret runway to a standing ovation, wearing the title, The Ultimate Angel, like a second pair of wings. Between those two images lies a story the fantasy never mentions. It is the story of someone who studied a machine that chews up girls and decided, very deliberately, to make herself indispensable to it, even if that meant treating her own body like a piece of equipment. She outlasted trends, generations of new faces, even the rise of Instagram models with follower counts for resumes. She did it by agreeing to demands most people would not dream of making of themselves. Twice a day boxing, liquid diets, dehydration protocols, a public persona built on seduction, and a private life governed by Catholic rules. In a business obsessed with youth, Adriana Lima's real trick was not staying young, it was staying willing. The price of that willingness is where the real story begins. Before she was a myth on a runway, she was a child in heat and noise. Adriana Francesca Lima was born on the 12th of June, 1981, in Salvador de Bahia, in Brazil's northeast, a city where the air tastes of salt and exhaust and frying oil, and where beauty and poverty sit side by side on the bus. Salvador is the kind of place travel magazines call paradise and locals call real life. Baroque churches, Atlantic beaches, and whole neighborhoods built on improvisation. In that world, being pretty might earn you a long look or a stray compliment, but it does not pay the rent. Her father left when she was very young. The absence was not the cinematic kind with slammed doors and shouted speeches. It was quieter and therefore more permanent. One day he was a presence, soon he was a story. Her mother, Maria da Graça, a social worker, raised her alone. The apartment they shared was small, the walls thin enough that neighbors' arguments and music bled through. The house was not filled with designer clothes or fashion magazines. It was filled with practical instructions and unspoken warnings. Work hard, behave properly. Do not expect the world to be kind. On Sundays, they went to church. Catholicism in Salvador is not a polite, distant ritual. It is sweat and incense, and kneeling on sore knees. Candles lit for problems no one says out loud. Adriana watched her mother cross herself and whisper prayers that seemed less about miracles and more about getting through the week. Somewhere between the pews and the kitchen table, she absorbed a second set of lessons, more instinctive than articulated. God might be watching, but landlords still needed to be paid. People left, and sometimes the only way to make them stay was to make yourself indispensable. Brazil treats beauty as a public conversation. Bodies are debated out loud on buses and beaches. A nose, a waist, a pair of legs. Nothing is too intimate to be evaluated. Growing up, Adriana heard those conversations around her and about her. The eyes came first, big, dark, watchful, then the mouth, full and soft. The kind of mouth advertising agencies will one day use to sell lipstick and lust. Older women would tell her mother, "Essa menina vai longe," that girl will go far, as if they could already see the billboards. As a girl in Salvador, she mostly felt awkward, shy, slightly out of place in her own skin. In her school photos, she is not standing in a spotlight. She is pressed into the row with everyone else, half smiling, shoulders slightly rounded as if making herself smaller. If there is a moment where her life splits into before and after, it arrives dressed as a favor. A friend from school wanted to enter a local beauty contest, but was too nervous to go alone. Adriana went along for support, stepped in front of a camera she did not particularly trust, and won. The prize was small. Some products, a bit of local attention, but it pushed her name onto desks it had no business reaching. Someone from a Sao Paulo agency saw the photos. Someone suggested more pictures. Another contest. A trip. At 15, she entered Ford's Supermodel of Brazil competition and won that too. At 16, she placed second in Ford's Supermodel of the World. The words Supermodel of the World sound like a fantasy. For a girl who had grown up watching her mother count coins at the market, they sounded like a ticket. But tickets always come with fine print. Printed at the bottom of this one, invisible to teenage eyes, were 3 words: leave everything behind. To collect on the promise, she had to leave Salvador. Leave Portuguese. Leave the familiar chaos of Bahia for an entirely different kind of chaos in New York. The model apartment hallway, where this story opens, was not glamorous. Fluorescent lights hummed. The carpet smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and too many people. The apartment itself was crowded with girls who all woke up hungry in more ways than one. Hungry for food, for work, for attention, for some sign that they were not about to be sent home. Days took on a rhythm that felt less like a career and more like an audition that never ended. The agency would hand out casting sheets in the morning. Girls would mark subway lines in pen, plan out how to cross as many addresses off as possible before offices closed. They would stand in line in stairwells behind other girls who looked just as tall, just as thin, just as hopeful. Inside white rooms, casting directors barely looked up from their desks. Walk, turn, smile, leave your book. Compliments were sparse. Criticism was clinical. Too commercial, too sexy, too dark for this client. The subtext was clear. You are a product being evaluated, and products do not get to have feelings. At night, the apartment was a chorus of whispered phone calls and muffled crying through thin walls. Girls compared casting counts like soldiers comparing injuries. I had 8 today. They said I'm not editorial enough. They told me to come back with my hair straight. Everyone was learning, in real time, the brutal calculus of desirability. The thing that makes you special in one room can make you irrelevant in another. Beauty was a currency, but the exchange rate changed every hour. Adriana's advantage was also her liability. She didn't look like everyone else. Her ancestry, Portuguese, indigenous, African, maybe a hint of Caribbean, gave her a face people called exotic, a word that sounds like a compliment until you realize it means from somewhere we don't fully recognize. High fashion liked that ambiguity. Commercial clients did too. But ambiguity alone does not pay New York rent, and there is nothing more terrifying than knowing the thing everyone praises you for is also the thing that could be replaced tomorrow by the next ambiguous face from the next country. In those early years, she learned a truth that would shape everything that came after. Beauty gets you into rooms, but reliability is what keeps you in the building. Agencies like girls who show up on time. Clients like girls who hit their marks and do not complain. The industry as a whole likes girls who will do whatever is asked, however unreasonable, and still be camera-ready at 7 a.m. The next morning. Once, after a 14-hour day of back-to-back catalog shoots, she came home so dizzy she had to sit on the floor of the shower because standing up felt unsafe. The next morning, she still made it to call time. No one asked how she was. They asked whether she had brought the right shoes. Her only power at the beginning really was to say yes. So she said it, over and over, and she took notes. On who got what jobs, on what clients valued, on which women's careers seemed to evaporate as soon as their faces became familiar. Somewhere between castings and cramped dinners of takeout eaten from plastic containers, she began to understand that survival here would not come from being the most beautiful girl in the room. It would come from being the most useful. It is into this calculation that Victoria's Secret entered like a new kind of weather system. In 1999, the brand's televised fashion show was turning from simple runway into global event. It was selling more than underwear. It was selling a very specific mythology. That sexiness could be distilled into a handful of women with impossible bodies and wings. That year, two young Brazilians walked its runway for the first time, Gisele Bündchen and Adriana Lima. From the audience's perspective, they were part of the same wave, tall, tan, early 2000s bombshells who brought something warmer and less icy than the heroin chic look of the decade before. From inside the machinery, they represented two entirely different understandings of power. Gisele saw Victoria's Secret as a springboard. By 19, she was already earning more than most of her peers. Runway shows for Versace, Dior, Valentino, campaigns for every luxury brand that wanted someone who looked both glamorous and athletic. For her, the televised lingerie spectacle was exposure valuable. Yes, but always in service of building something bigger that she could own. Businesses, product lines, a name that stood alone. Her strategy was horizontal expansion. Adriana looked at the same glittering stage and saw something else, a fortress. To her, this was not just another booking. It was a ritual with built-in recurrence. One giant show every year. One brand willing to invest money and myth in a stable of faces. One place where, if you earned it, you could become not just a model who walks the show, but an angel, a title that came with wings, contracts, and, most importantly, continuity. In an industry that treated girls as disposable, continuity was the rarest commodity of all. She made a decision that sounds simple, but was anything but. She would attach herself to this fortress and climb its walls from the inside, while Gisele used VS as a loudspeaker to broadcast her brand outward. Adriana would concentrate her energy inward, making herself so essential to this one machine that removing her would feel like breaking one of its central gears. It was a bet on depth over breadth, on tenure over constant reinvention. It also meant something more intimate and more brutal, that her body would have to meet the same impossible standard not just for one season, but for as long as the fortress chose to stand. Making yourself indispensable to a fantasy requires treating yourself as if you are not quite real. Once she became an official angel, Adriana began to shape her life around the show's yearly cycle. From the outside, the runway looked like a 90-minute dream sequence. From the inside, it was the tip of an iceberg made from months of training and hunger. While other models rotated through jobs, campaigns, editorials, occasional talk show appearances, Adriana oriented her calendar around one looming date. Everything moved toward November. She went to war on her own behalf, in the only way the industry rewarded. In the gym, boxing became less a workout and more a second identity. Twice a day, she would lace up gloves, wrap her hands, and step into a ring or onto a mat. Trainers pushed her through rounds of combinations until her shoulders burned and her lungs felt like they'd been replaced with fire. She skipped rope until sweat soaked through her clothes, did sprint intervals, lifted weights, chosen not to build bulk, but to carve. People who trained professional fighters looked at her routine and nodded with respect, if not outright concern. This was not staying in shape. This was peak conditioning. The difference is that most athletes have seasons. Adriana's season was essentially her life. There were costs you did not see under the stage lights. Days when her legs trembled climbing stairs because lactic acid from the morning's workout hadn't yet drained. Nights when she went to bed hungry enough that sleep came in thin, restless sheets. Months when her period disappeared. a silent memo from her body that the current regime registered as emergency conditions. An athletic coach might have pulled a competitor off the track for rest. The fashion machine simply penciled in another fitting. Then there was the diet, a word that in her world did not mean preference, but discipline enforced on the body. 9 days before each show, she cut out solid food entirely. Protein shakes, supplements, occasional spoonfuls of yogurt if a nutritionist insisted. Her body became a system of inputs and outputs, calories measured against runway expectations. In the final 12 hours before stepping on stage, she cut off water. No sips, no ice chips, nothing. It is the same trick fighters use to make weight. The body sheds water. The skin draws tight over muscle. Every contour sharpens. Under lights that flatten lesser silhouettes, hers exploded into relief. When she finally spoke about this in an interview, the world reacted differently than it might have a decade earlier. Nutritionists called it dangerous. Commentators called it an eating disorder with a lighting rig. Adriana tried to explain. This was not a lifestyle. It was an event protocol, done under medical supervision. And no, young girls should not copy it. All of that may have been true. Another truth lingered quietly underneath. This is what it took to embody a fantasy the world had agreed to treat as casual entertainment. The physical extremity was only one part of the split screen she lived on. The other part was spiritual. In the same breath that journalists described her as the sexiest woman alive, Adriana described herself as a devout Catholic. She prayed every day. She carried rosary beads. In her early 20s, in an era when pop culture treated chastity as a joke, she told a reporter she believed in saving her virginity for marriage. The internet erupted in confused fascination. How was the face of a lingerie brand also the face of abstinence? How could the same woman sell fantasy to millions and talk earnestly about sin and salvation? The answer, for her, was to compartmentalize. On set, she was an angel in the corporate sense. Lingerie, smolder, practiced flirtation through the lens. Off set, she was something else entirely. A believer with rules she did not break. A woman who went home not to parties but to prayer and family. In an industry that measures you constantly from the outside, she built an interior code that belonged solely to her. It is tempting to call that hypocrisy. It is more accurate to call it survival. If everything about you is up for sale, then the parts you refuse to sell become a kind of private sanctuary. By the middle of the 2000s, Adriana Lima was tethered to Victoria's Secret so tightly that it was hard to imagine one without the other. Super Bowl commercials helped cement that image. In 2008 and 2012, she appeared in ads watched by more than 100 million people staring straight down the camera at living rooms that usually reserved that level of attention for quarterbacks and rock stars. Men who had never bought lingerie knew her face. Women who disliked the brand still recognized her in airport billboards and perfume stands. She had achieved the rarest thing a model can achieve: ubiquity. The fantasy machine, however, does not stop spinning for personal milestones. In 2009, Adriana married Serbian NBA player Marko Jaric. The match looked perfect on paper. Beauty and athlete, Brazilian and Balkan, international careers crossing in hotel lobbies and courtside seats. The tabloids ate it up, framing the wedding as a real-life merger of two glamorous worlds. When her first daughter, Valentina, was born later that year, it would have been entirely respectable and entirely expected for Adriana to ease away from the most punishing part of her work. Instead, she did what she had always done when faced with a binary the world tried to hand her. She refused to choose. Motherhood did not end her career as an angel. It reoriented the battlefield. The months after Valentina's birth looked different from the years of single-minded training that had come before, but not in the way most outsiders imagined. There were sleepless nights and diaper changes, and the 100 tiny crises of an infant's day. There were also boxing sessions wedged between feedings, treadmill runs squeezed into the hours when the baby napped, nutrition plans recalibrated to rebuild a body that had housed another human being and was still expected to look like it never had. There is an image that never appeared in any campaign but might be the truest symbol of that time. Adriana, in a dark kitchen at 5 a.m., breast pump on the table, gym bag at her feet, scrolling through photos of last year's show while the coffee machine hisses. On the wall, a schedule, pediatrician appointments and fittings sharing space in the same cramped boxes. Behind the glossy narrative of getting her body back was a more honest one. Her body had never really been hers to begin with. It belonged, variously, to a newborn who needed it, and a brand that relied on it, and a woman of faith who was trying to reconcile both demands with her own exhausted heart. When she returned to the runway in 2010, hardly a year after giving birth, wearing the fantasy bra again as if nothing in her anatomy had changed, the applause was deafening. Commentators marveled at the discipline of a woman who could bounce back so quickly. Few people asked whether the miracle they were celebrating was also a warning. Every woman who has given birth and then watched coverage of Adriana's post-pregnancy body knows the subtext. If she can erase the visible evidence of motherhood in under a year, why can't you? The pattern repeated after her second daughter, Sienna, was born in 2012. Pregnancy, subtle public absence, then return. Same wings, same abs, same smile. The difference this time was the world into which she was returning. Instagram, launched 2 years earlier, had turned private lives into broadcast material. Young models no longer needed booking sheets and agency boards to build an audience. They needed phones. Founds Gigi Hadid, Kendall Jenner, and others whose value was measured not just in measurements but in followers began to join the Victoria's Secret lineup. The brand, which had once built its angels in relative privacy and then unveiled them on television, now fed a constant drip of behind-the-scenes content into social media feeds. Workouts, fittings, more workouts. The spectacle of what it took to look effortless stopped being a secret. Adriana adapted. She posted training clips, glimpses of her children, snapshots from sets, but there was always a sense that she was holding part of herself back. The fortress she had built with Victoria's Secret now had a second wall, a psychological one between the woman she was and the image the world consumed. She knew exactly how much vulnerability the algorithm rewarded and how much would threaten the very mystery that kept her in demand. That wall came into sharpest relief in late 2017, when she wrote something on Instagram that felt less like branding and more like confession. She explained that she had been asked to shoot a sexy video for social media and felt, suddenly, that something had shifted. "I am tired of the impositions," she wrote, "tired of waking up every day, trying to fit into an imposed stereotype." She declared that she would no longer take off her clothes for an empty cause. She did not name the client. She did not cancel any contracts. She simply drew a line around her own body in public language for the first time in her career. The statement landed in a world already moving through a reckoning with how it treats women's bodies. The Me Too movement had exploded months earlier. Stories about executives and abuses of power filled the news. Victoria's Secret itself was drawing criticism for its lack of diversity and its insistence on selling a narrow ideal of sexiness. In that context, Adriana's words sounded less like a marketing message and more like a woman at the center of the old system, quietly acknowledging that the cost had been higher than anyone was willing to admit. By then, the cracks in the life built around the fortress were no longer just physical. Her marriage strained under the weight of schedules that never aligned, and a reality in which her body belonged to the public just as much as to her family. While other couples argued about chores or in-laws, Adriana and Marco argued about flights, missed birthdays, the way time zones turned intimacy into logistics. In 2014, they announced their separation, and the press treated it like another fashionable breakup. For her, it was something different. Proof that even a woman who could micromanage every inch of muscle could not always hold together the parts of her life that required softness instead of control. Meanwhile, the culture outside the runway was shifting. The glossy fantasy of the early 2000s looked increasingly out of step with conversations younger women were having about bodies, consent, and representation. Headlines questioned whether shows built on one narrow body type had any place in a world talking about mental health and eating disorders. Activists pointed out how many girls had grown up measuring themselves against women like Adriana without ever being told what those bodies cost. For almost 2 decades, she had been proof that discipline could suspend the normal rules of time. Now, I am Emily. Now, the idea that anyone should have to work that hard for anyone else's gaze began to feel like an accusation, not an aspiration. Inside the brand, newer faces cycled in and out, promoted in social campaigns, and then quietly let go when engagement dipped. Adriana watched entire micro-generations of models arrive, post, walk, and vanish, while she remained, a constant in a world built on replacement. There was a peculiar loneliness in that kind of stability. She was the safe choice for executives and the familiar thrill for audiences. But being irreplaceable in a system designed to replace everyone also meant standing mostly alone. When the younger angels called her Mama, it was affectionate, but it was also a reminder. In this world, 35 was already a kind of old age, and the only reason she was still there was because she had chained herself to the machine more tightly than anyone else. A year after her Instagram statement, she made her acknowledgement, physical. Her final Victoria's Secret show, in 2018, was staged in New York. From the outside, it looked like every other show. Glitter, music, an audience filled with celebrities. Backstage, the mood was different. Producers had prepared a retrospective montage of her greatest hits, clips of her first walk as a teenager, her early turns with oversized wings, close-ups of her blowing kisses to the camera in slow motion. She was, by then, the longest-serving angel in the brand's history. Every other woman from the early years had left. She was the last remaining thread tying the current spectacle to the era that had created it. As she stepped onto the runway for her farewell walk, the screens above the stage lit up with those old images. The music slowed. The audience rose. The camera closed in on her face. For once, it betrayed something the fantasy usually edits out: vulnerability. Her lips trembled, tears gathered. She pressed her hands to her heart in the universal gesture of gratitude and overwhelm. It was impossible to tell where the performance ended and the person began. She was saying goodbye to a role that had defined her adult life, to a machine she had spent 2 decades feeding, to a body she had sculpted over and over to fit someone else's dream. She was also, quietly, stepping into a future where no one, not an executive, not a casting director, not a television audience could demand that version of her again. The show limped on without her for 1 more year, and then stopped. Official statements attributed the end to changing consumer preferences, declining ratings, a shift in brand strategy. Unofficially, it felt as if the departure of its ultimate angel had forced the brand to confront a truth it had been avoiding. You cannot sell the same fantasy forever in a world that has started to ask who pays for it. So what does a woman like Adriana Lima do when the fortress she chose for herself closes its gates? In the years since, she has been both very visible and strangely private. She has walked for houses like Versace and Miu Miu, appeared on magazine covers that frame her not as a fantasy, but as a legend, a survivor of a vanished era. She has fronted beauty campaigns that lean less on her waistline and more on the fact that everyone, across generations, knows her face. She has had more children, allowed her body to be visibly pregnant and postpartum without racing back into the old extremes. For the first time, paparazzi photos of her in public show not an unbroken line of abdominal muscle, but the softness of someone whose body's primary job is no longer to reassure strangers. The shift is subtle but seismic. In earlier years, a candid photo showing the faintest hint of softness might have triggered an emergency workout plan, a call to a trainer, a recalibration of calories. Now, she posts images of herself in oversized sweaters, at the beach with her kids, in the gym without the countdown clock of a looming runway. Boxing is still there. She has called it her therapy, but the purpose has changed. She talks less about being ready for a single show and more about feeling strong enough to chase her children, to travel, to sleep. She also looks back at the fortress with a clarity that would have been dangerous when she still lived inside it. She has acknowledged that some of her old routines were not healthy, that the image plastered on billboards was the result of decisions she would not want her daughters to make. She can say now, from the outside, that the myth of the angel was carefully constructed, that behind every effortless appearance was a network of trainers, nutritionists, lighting designers, retouchers, editors. That admission does not cancel the power of what she accomplished. It reframes it. For a generation of young women, Adriana Lima will always be frozen under runway lights, blowing a kiss through the camera. For the industry, she will be a line on a list. 18 shows, 3 fantasy bras, nearly 20 years, with one of the most recognizable brands in the world. For herself, the story may look different. A girl from Salvador, who leveraged her beauty in the most unforgiving system imaginable, who turned self-discipline into a shield, who built a life for her family out of a job the world still struggles to take seriously, and who eventually decided that refusing was as powerful as agreeing. It is easy to look at her career and see only triumph. The money, the longevity, the adoration. It is harder, but more honest, to ask what it required for so long to keep saying yes. Yes to hunger. Yes to exhaustion. Yes to being looked at before being listened to. Yes to being both an object of desire and a symbol of an impossible standard other women would be measured against. When we clap for that kind of endurance, we should be clear about what exactly we are applauding. Adriana Lima's myth was that she did not age, did not crack, did not waver. The reality is more complicated and, in its own way, more impressive. She aged in front of the world and kept working. She cracked, privately, and kept going. She wavered, and then chose to stop. She was, for almost 20 years, willing to treat her body as equipment to secure power in a system that otherwise would have discarded her by 25. Her real trick was not staying forever young. It was surviving long enough to decide what to do with the years after the myth ended. The fortress she chose is gone now. The wings hang in storage or in museums. The runway is dark. Somewhere in Salvador or Sao Paulo or New York, another girl is stepping into a fluorescent hallway carrying a suitcase and a translated dream. Someone will tell her where to stand, when to turn, how to smile. Her job, at first, will be to say yes. Adriana Lima's story lingers as both an inspiration and a warning. You can beat the machine at its own game for a very long time, but the machine is never the one that pays the bill. In a culture that still asks women to trade their bodies for a shot at security or significance, perhaps the most radical thing she has done is not the years of saying yes, but the moment she finally said no to empty causes, to impossible demands, to the idea that staying willing is the only way to stay worthy. The fantasy will find new faces. The question her life leaves us with is whether we are ready to build systems where women don't have to become myths, just to be allowed to grow old.